Hi folks, Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you for yet another Sunday session. This week is a little different to normal Sunday sessions. This week being the 25th of April is clearly Anzac Day. So I'd like to just take a moment, to pause and reflect for those who have given for our country. Thanks, folks. Welcome back. Yet another Sunday session. This week, we're talking about knowing what to build. I get many questions about trying to work out how to determine what is the appropriate thing to build, in going into a new market and going into a new area. And I guess the expression is build it and they will come. But what I'm saying is if you build it right, they will come. So let's take a look at what that's going to actually involve in the process. Now, as property developers, we are makers of community. That's something that we tend to forget quite a lot, okay? If we go back in time over 230 odd years, Australia was a one-lot land subdivision. And whilst I know that there's a lot of controversy in how we actually came to, inhabit this land, we are here at this particular point in time. And as, the makers of community, we are the people who actually go and create the houses, the shops, the roads, everything that we actually live in. So everything was created by a property developer. And it was created by a property developer by actually understanding what the community was actually looking for and the demands that they were looking at. So when we start to understand what the community is doing and where the community is going, that is going to give us some great insights into what the community is actually demanding. And if we can build it by predicting what is actually happening, by reading trends in demographics and things like that, then we're going to be able to build the product type just in time for them to actually go and create that. Of course, understanding what they want is one thing, and then seeing whether or not we are the first to do that, looking at the supply and demand of that exact kind of product type is then the next thing in the process. So, okay, let's have a look at what we're actually going to have a look at over the next little bit. Okay, so firstly, we're going to have a look at some of the demographics that are actually sitting out there, how and where you actually get those demographics, how to actually start to interpret those demographics, and what are some of the things that are the key drivers and key influences in the kind of product type that you're going to create. Now, clearly the permutations of this across Australia are going to be impossible for me to give you all of the different derivatives, but what we should be able to give you is some pretty good insights into how and where the changing landscape of Australia is going, what that actually means too, and that sort of thing. Of course, once we've got our view of the demographics of the area, then we can actually then go out and start to prove that. Okay, so we want to start to look at things like our development approvals in the area and see who else is actually trying to build the same stock. Getting an approval for something from council is one thing, though. Then getting that to be actually constructed is another thing. So looking at construction approvals and then finally funding approvals to see who is actually creating that stock for you, to see whether or not there's too many people actually building the same stuff. We're going to go out and talk to agents to actually understand that the buyers that we're actually looking for are actually out in the market and that sort of thing. And obviously pound the footpath and actually prove that all of that is in play. But I guess from a demographics perspective, now, all of us know that the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or the ABS, is the fontanel of all knowledge when it comes to our demographics and our statistics. And they collect that largely through a thing called a census, and the census happens every couple of years. And I'll talk to some of the stats that sit in and around that. But when we start to look at how they collect that data, that can then be spun in a whole bunch of ways. Now, the ABS are really good for giving us access to the raw data, okay? What they're not very good at is the ability to present that in a way that is graphical in nature and so is much more easily digestible. And so there are a number of other organizations out there that grab the ABS data and they, munge the data and then reflect that back to you with graphs and maps and all sorts of things like that. So some of those organizations are one called profile.id. So profile.id.com.au, microburbs.com.au, and also another government organisation called the Australian Institute of Family Studies, or AIFS. Now, those three organisations between them, they munge that data in such a way that it actually starts to become relatively easily digestible, and hence it's going to be much easier to actually understand who is in our area, what are they looking for, all those sorts of things, okay? Now, let's start to think about when we're looking at the kinds of people that are living there. So there's, I guess, a whole range of categories that's going to fall into. So there's young singles, so they, I guess, newly into the workforce or into the at university type age. There's going to be young couples with no kids. There's going to be young couples with kids. Okay, so young families. There's going to be single parent families. There's going to be larger families that have actually started to grow, double income families. There's going to be people that are, I guess, reaching the end of the workforce and downsizing. And there's also aging population. So we've got a whole bunch of different people that may want a completely different product. And so what we need to do is to say, well, how many of what kind of category are sitting in some of those areas? So for example, singles, you know, they would be wanting something that's no fuss, self-contained, low maintenance, okay? Young couples will be wanting something similar, no fuss, self-contained again. Young families are probably going to want something that's got a backyard and that sort of thing. Single parent families, they're wanting the same kind of product, but I guess you've got to understand whether or not they've actually got the buying power to actually take on the product that you're actually creating. Then there's downsizers who generally are getting out of a bigger product that they bought many years ago, and they're looking to change their lifestyle, have something where they can potentially go on, you know, a 3-month cruise or, you know, trip around the world, those sorts of things, come back and have it in exactly the same condition that it was when they left, and be able to, I guess, have a much nicer lifestyle by actually downsizing. They also want to start to consider things like aging in place and the ability to say, well, I'm going to be here for the next 20 or 30 years, but I'm starting to get a little bit on, and I want to make sure that, you know, this house is, or this dwelling is actually going to be able to look after my needs as I start to age a little bit. There are also, you know, things like, you know, having wider doorways so that if and when they need to have a wheelchair or a Zimmer frame or something along those lines, that they can actually do that. Making sure that whilst you may not have it right now, things like handrails that go into shower areas and toilet areas, those sorts of things. So there's lots of different things that we need to consider about what it is that we're actually going to try and create. Now, all of that's then going to feed into, I guess, the type of dwelling. So is it going to be a house? Is it going to be a house on a small lot? Is it going to be a townhouse? Is it going to be a manor house? Is it going to be a duplex? Is it going to be, how big is this thing going to be? Is it apartments perhaps? How big are these things? How many bedrooms? What sort of amenity are they going to have? So number of bedrooms, number of car parks, I guess, what entertainment opportunities are both either in the property itself or maybe in the complex that you're actually creating. You need to understand what the supply and demand of that particular product type is to know whether or not there's enough people to actually take that stock. So is there a lot of that stock already on hand because it's been built over years and years and years by the previous people? And if so, how much of that stock already exists? What is the age of that stock? What is the quality of that stock, the size, the amenity, et cetera, et cetera? And then what is coming through the pipeline? So what development approvals are already sitting in place that might be at a position where they've both got development approval and potentially even building approval and what they call shovel ready. So what potentially is going to happen. So you want to start to be thinking about what that is going to start to look like, okay? Now, some factors that you need to consider when you start to look at the demographics of your area. Demographics can be done, I guess, on a very broad stage. So you could say all of Australia, then you could narrow it down to say the state, then you could narrow it down to say the city, and you can narrow it down even further to, I guess, the the suburb, and even sub-suburbs, okay? And I'll talk to some of that in a sec. But when you start to do that, we want to start to think about, well, what does that household structure look like? So is it going to be singles? Is it going to be couples? Is it going to be families? Is it going to be single parent families? Those sorts of things. So I guess what that household structure starts to look like and how many of that structure are in that area. What is the typical age of the people in that area also? So are they largely in the 25 to 45 age group? Are they alternatively somewhere in the 50 to 75 type age group? What sex are they going to be? Are they predominantly all male? Are they predominantly female? Sometimes that's not necessarily, I guess, the same ratio as you'd actually think. The nationality. Now, this one's a really interesting one because there are certain kind of nationalities that want a very particular kind of product type. So, for example, excuse me, you might be wanting a property that's got a lot of feng shui, for example. You could have some nationalities have, I guess, a tradition where they actually start to look after their elders, and so they all live in one giant family. So you might have multi-generational actually living in the one household. So you want to start to think about things like that. You want to start to think about the household income, or what is called the affluence score. So how much money have people actually got to buy your product? Now, remembering you're trying to sell your product at a particular price point. So if there's not enough people with enough money to pay that price point, then clearly that's an indicator that what you're trying to do is a little bit overkill. You want to start to understand whether or not the area, not just the product type, but the area is family friendly. So can you walk to the shops, for example? Can you walk to school? What's the public transport? All of those sorts of things. You want to start to be looking at all of that. Then there's a thing called the housing tenure, and that is whether or not there is a mortgage in place. Is that mortgage paid out? Is it a mortgage with a long way to go, or is it predominantly renters that actually live in the area? So what is that average mortgage size? That's going to be a little bit influenced by the household income, but I guess there's a number of other factors that go into that as well. So that then leads into what is the ownership ratio versus owner-occupier versus investor. So when we start to think about all of those things, we go, well, if it's largely investor stock in the area and I'm going to build something that's owner-occupier, then there might not be enough people to actually take on that stock. Equally, if it's largely owner-occupier in the area and I build some investor stock, that's clearly not necessarily going to fly either. So we have to be very careful in how some of those things start to actually play out. Now, I mentioned it before, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is, I guess, the fontanel of most of this data, okay? So you can grab that data yourself. It's largely free. It comes in many, many formats, and I'll touch on that, but it's gathered from a couple of different places. Now, the most predominant place that it grabs it from is census data, and the census is typically done every 4 years or so. The last census was actually done on the 10th of August in 2021. It takes them a while to then process that data, and then it slowly starts to get released as they start to process it. So the data was actually released, our next census, I should say, is 10th of August 2021. Our last census was actually done in 2016. So my humble apologies, I got that wrong. So the upcoming census that's going to be done on the 10th of August in 2021, that's going to take a slow rollout. So there's a 3-stage rollout on what that's going to be. And that's the first stage of that is anticipated to roll out in June of 2022. And as they start to distill the data, then they drip feed that out as they have, I guess, worked out what some of the indications of all of that are. Then they also grab other data sets from a whole bunch of other government organizations. So I guess your Medicare, your ATO, all of those sorts of things, and they start to gather that together. Remembering the government has got access to a whole bunch of I guess, every single government organisation, but also they also have the ability to tap into payrolls and super funds and all sorts of things like that. So they're gathering all of this data. So they also do things like surveys. They do what they call administrative collections, which means that they'll have a particular purpose where they'll actually go out and start to collect data if they've got a particular use case that they actually want to do. Okay, so now, when they do that, they can distill the information down to what's happening on an individual person basis, a household basis, and or a business basis, but they present that back to us in a way that's anonymized, so we can't actually tell who the person was, but we can actually tell how many people fit that particular demographic type, for example. Okay, as I said, the next census timelines. Okay, so the next release will be June 22. You're going to start to see things like, I guess, age and sex, what the marital status is, whether or not we're Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, where we were actually residing at the time of census. Now they say, where were you staying that particular night? Remember. What's the Australian citizenship ratio? So what is our country of birth, year of arrival, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of that I guess the primary stuff that we're going to need is going to be released on that June 22 date. After that, then there's going to be a second release, which is going to talk about employment statistics, occupation types, whether or not they're privately employed, government employed, workplace addresses, things like that, what sort of industry people are in, how many hours people actually work. And then the last phase will be mid-2023, and there'll be a whole bunch of extra stuff in that. So things like homelessness, I guess, socioeconomic indices and all those sorts of things. So a long staged rollout, but we're very close to a new set of data. Now, because what we've got in the old data is based on 2016, it starts to become, I guess, a little bit dated, but we can still get some very quality outcomes from actually looking at that data. And we can see trends by comparing this census with the previous census with the previous one before that. And we start to see a whole bunch of trends pushing along the way. Now, as I said, the ABS releases this data in many formats. Okay, so they do what they call infographics, where they've actually distilled it for you, and it's nice, easy to digest. There's also some quick stats that you can actually grab where they bring it down to a particular statistical area, but that is a very, very high level. Then there's community profiles where they start to go a little bit lower. And then there's what they call data packs, which is, I guess, the raw data typically in a comma delimited faction, or what they call a CSV. And then they've got, for those of you who are building information sets that actually might want to display this, then you can actually purchase data. So they've got 3 or 4 ways of actually getting it for free. And then they've got, I guess, one way where you actually pay for it, but it's super detailed in how and what you actually do. Now, when the ABS actually do that, what they do is they start to group the data together in a whole bunch of fashions. Okay, so now there are, I'm going to say, close to 15 odd different categories of groupings. I'm going to talk to the ones that are really, really common. Okay, so these are the main categories in what we would actually try to see on a daily basis. So there's all of Australia, that's pretty obvious. Then there's the individual state, and then what they call a statistical area. Now there are 4 different levels of statistical area. And as you go lower in number, then it becomes more and more refined. So statistical area of 4, statistical area of 3, 2, 1, etc. And then finally, a little microbyte of data, which is called a mesh block. Okay, now when we start to look at the statistical area 4, or what they call an SA4, okay, this is generally in groupings of about 100,000 people, okay? So it's quite a large grouping, and depending upon, I guess, how the topography is broken up and that sort of thing, it might be anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 people. So it's quite a large, I guess, pool that they actually grab it from. Then they go down to SA3, which is about 20,000 people typically, but it could be anywhere from 30,000 to 130,000 in that size. SA2 goes much, much lower. And then SA1 could go down to anywhere between 200 and 800 people. So when you're trying to get your stats, and then below that is a thing called a mesh block, and the mesh block is somewhere between 30 and 60 people. Okay, so you can get super, super, super refined detail, and all of this is mapped out. So you can actually see, okay, I know exactly all of the SA1 areas in my particular area. So there might be 10 or 15 in your particular suburb. And so you can start to go, well, in this little patch, this is the demographic. In this little patch, this is the demographic. So you can get very, very, very detailed in the level of data that you can actually grab from these ties. Now, what are the things that they actually grab? Well, or what can you actually start to see, I should say. So there's going to be things like your sex, your gender, I guess your sexual orientation, okay? Things like the housing variables, so what kind of products that you're actually living in, what year you actually arrived in Australia, what kind of household that you're actually living in. Is it a family? Are you living by yourself? Are you in a single, like a single parent family? Things like that. There are going to be things like what kind of, where do you work in the workforce? So what kind of industry vertical are you working in? Are you a professional white collar worker, or are you a blue collar worker? I guess, what are the income levels that you actually generate from those? Country of birth, language standards, ancestry, occupations, religion, housing types, as I said, whether or not you're an Indigenous Australian, whether or not you are an Australian citizen natively, or whether or not you actually have become an Australian citizen, what age categories there are, and number of children actually born as well. So lots of super refined detail in what can actually be grabbed. Now, what's really important to us is when we start to think about this, to say, well, the kind of people that we're likely to be selling our product to, we largely have two very high level, I guess, categories that we're going to sell to. So people who are owner occupier and people who are investors. Okay. Now, when we think about who our finished purchaser is, we have to start thinking about like in that sort of context. So from a home ownership trends perspective, there's a few things that over time, what we've learned in watching all these census data has actually come through. So what we do know is that around 70% of Australian households are actually either own or in the process of actually owning their own home. Now, remarkably, that rate has been really stable for nearly 40 odd years. The percentage has not really moved a lot, but there are some changes in who in that category actually starts to own it. So what sort of age groups start to own them. So the proportion of Australian households who own their home outright is far from stable. So there's people buying their home, that has been stable. People who own their home, that's far from stable. Okay, so based on the stats, what we've seen is that the number of people who own their properties outright has dropped from 45% in 1947 down to 32% in 1976, and about 43% in 1996, and then 35% in 2006. So you can see it's got this downward trend, okay? So there's less and less people actually starting to own their home outright. And there's a whole bunch of reasons that start to go into that, which is then starting to influence the kind of product we create. And it's really important that you actually understand the trends here. So what actually are some of the things that actually influence this? Okay, so clearly the age of the person actually that owns the house or is buying the house, I should say, they go through cycles as they start young and get older and older. Okay, so generally the cycle is that you tend to rent during the early years, then you move into a home and you purchase a mortgage during the early stage. That might be for a very small family, and that might grow over time. And then as the family moves on and you've lived there for a number of years, that's when the outright ownership tends to happen much, much later in your life. So it's a staggered approach as we go. So the relationship between age and home ownership has always meant that the older we are, the more likely are that we actually own the property. Hence, the younger we are, the less likely we are to own it outright. So it's a fairly simple algorithm that actually sits behind that, okay? But there are other things that actually influence that home ownership. So the rate of home ownership has massively changed based on whether or not they are couples or whether or not they're actually a single household. So a couple clearly has two incomes. So by two incomes, that means that they have more ability to purchase, I guess, a more expensive home and also more able to absorb the cost of running that home. Whereas when there's only single incomes, then generally the proportion of cost to run the home versus the proportion of cost to actually own the mortgage means that the ability to purchase and own that property becomes much, much more difficult when you're on a single income. So clearly that means that where there are a lot of single incomes, the proportion is that they're more likely to be renters, okay? I guess some of the other things that influence, I guess, the home ownership would be housing affordability. Now, housing affordability has gone up and up and up as wage growth has gone up, as I guess inflation has changed, as size of properties have gone and that sort of thing. And it's getting to the point where housing affordability is actually becoming quite challenging, and hence the size of the property is starting to shrink in order to keep the housing affordable. And so what was the old McMansion of the past, where people were trying to purchase, as the new people are coming through and purchasing properties, they tend to be buying smaller and smaller properties, okay? So when we start to think about all of that, it starts to influence a whole bunch of outcomes. So when we see the combination of the kind of household, the kind of income, I guess the age of the people, those sorts of things, we can start to go, okay, given what it is, we can see different impacts on the kind of product that we're actually going to be creating, okay? So there was a couple of other points that I did want to make there. I'm just trying to pause while I catch my thoughts on that. A good way to actually measure the housing affordability rate. The Real Estate Institute of Australia actually has a metric which expresses the value of the home loan repayments versus the proportion of the median family income. So what they've got is a little indices that basically says, well, based on where that household income is, how much loan can they typically afford? So I guess go and look up that. So the Real Estate Institute of Australia was the one that I wanted to touch on there. Now, let's start to have a look at, I've got a couple of demographics that I've grabbed for you guys. So when we start to look at our housing tenure, so housing tenure is the way that the house is actually owned. So we've got down the bottom here our legend. And so this graph here is an owner without a mortgage. Now, as we can see, I guess the percentage has been slowly dropping over time. The number of people who actually own without a mortgage is becoming less and less and less. And that's because the cost of the properties are going up and up and up and up. Okay. Owners with a mortgage, you can see that this is actually going up. So whilst one is going down and the other one's going up, it means that relatively in the middle, the number of people trying to buy has been remaining stable, which is what I touched on before. But how much of that house they actually own is starting to diminish, which means that the cost of the home is starting to massively impact upon, I guess, the kind of stock that they can afford. Then we've got the number of renters. We're starting to get more and more renters in this space because the fact that they're not in a position where they can actually own. But it's what has interestingly changed is the number of renters in the private space versus those who are actually getting it from, I guess, the local housing authorities or state-based housing authorities. So the state-based housing authorities are providing less and less homes, but the number of private homes is going up and up and up. And that's had a large impact on government policies with regards to negative gearing and things like that to actually encourage people to actually build stock that is actually made for rental. Now, when we start to look at then, I guess the next one, that changing type of families over time. So as we can see, these different colors over here are the years. So when we look at one parent families, we can see that largely as a trend, the number of single parent families has been going up over time. Remember, more single parent families, more likely to rent because they've only got one income coming through. Number of couples only. So this is people not having kids. A lot more people are, I guess, not having children until much later in years. And so that number is starting to grow quite significantly. Couples with dependent children, well, the number of children that we actually are having is going down and down and down, and as is the number of people with dependent children. So these couples wouldn't be needing a yard, these couples would. Now, clearly, the number of people needing a yard is starting to change, okay? So we want to understand the fact that our product type over time can and will be changing, okay? Couple with non-dependent children, so they're at an age where they've actually grown up and or moved out, that is equally dropping, and other kinds of mix of families as we go. Now, when we start to look at aging across Australia, okay, so this dotted line here is the number between 0 and 14 years of age. So our population from a number of people age perspective is going down, down, down. So with the number of young people we've got is getting less and less and less. In contrast, the number of people who we've got who are getting older is going higher and higher and higher. Now, what that means is the number of people getting older are going to be wanting stock that is more age in place or potentially aged homes or things like that. So very different kind of product type, downsizes, for example. Whereas the number of people wanting something with a yard is changing significantly. So clearly, as our aging population, they don't want to be mowing lawns and things like that. So having a backyard is going to be problematic for them. And these guys here, because there's less and less kids, there's a less requirement for backyards. And so this is going to very much play into, I guess, the kind of product and the size of the product that we're actually trying to create. When we then start to look at your average household size, it used to be that we had about 4.5 kids per family. Now that has slowly dwindled over time, and this is, I guess where all the baby boomer type people who are now getting really old. Now we're only having about 2.6 people per family. Okay, so the average number of people per household has dropped massively over time, meaning that even when we build a family home, less bedrooms, less amount of backyard required, those sorts of things. Okay, and then when we start to look at the dwelling type by region, so this is just an example, we can actually break this down into many demographic areas. So this is one that's come from Profile ID. I've just used this for, I guess, the entire New South Wales and greater capital cities, but you can drill this down to almost anything. We can see how many are actually wanting a separate house, how many are wanting medium density, how many are in high density. And so we can see high density living has changed, medium density living has gone up, separate households has remained somewhat the same over time. Now we can drill that down into our, I guess, our SA1s and our SA2s to actually understand exactly what's actually happening in our little neighborhood, okay? So overall, what does this mean? So the key trends, we've got fewer young adults who are going to own their home outright, okay? So compared to previous generations, much less of them are actually trying to get into the market. The average weekly housing costs have grown over time, especially for families with dependent children. And so the housing affordability becomes quite challenging. Owning a home outright has become less common over time as our aging population, I guess, are the fortunate ones that are able to still own their home outright, whereas the rest of us are struggling to actually pay it off, okay? So almost half of single parent families actually rented in 2018, which is not that long ago, okay? Single parent families experience the highest average household costs as a percentage of their gross income, which means that if you see single parent families, then almost guaranteed they're going to be rentals, okay? And compared to other types of families, I guess people with young children tend to live in a standalone home. Now, as we start to break this out, okay, those different household types that I touched on, so couple with dependent children, okay, so we can, down the bottom again is our legend. So we can see the number of couples with dependent children actually with a mortgage, that's been relatively steady over time, but the amount that's owned outright versus private rental, you can see that is starting to, I guess, have a little bit of a divergent trend, okay? One parent with dependent children, you can see here, the ownership rates have gone massively down, okay? Instead, the rental rates have gone significantly up, and a lot of these are in, I guess, very few of them are actually owned outright, and a lot of housing authority type stock, okay? Couples with dependent children, so this is where there's two incomes. This is back to, actually, I think I've duplicated that one, so my humble apologies, ignore that one, folks. And single people, okay, so most of those people, lone person, there's a lot of them that actually are in a position where they actually own outright, but there's not many of them are actually trying to buy anymore. Okay, so a lot of them are doing private rentals. So lots of different, depending upon who the person is, the kind of family structure, you can see that that's massively impacting their ability to actually get into the housing market, and also the amount that they're actually going to be able to afford. Now, when we start to look at our demographics, how that's going to start to look is we're going to see little maps that look like this. Okay, so we can see from an age category perspective, so 15 to 24, for example, we can see quite heavy in that area, but predominantly more girls than boys. In this particular area, between 25 and 34, more boys than girls. And in the 35 to 44, so when we start to group it together, this is clearly, I guess, younger generation who are, I guess, slowly leaving home, potentially living as singles, potentially as young couples with no kids, but then there's not much aging in that particular area. So you're going to start to see things like that. When you then have a look at, I guess, the family composition, we're going to see things like this. So how many one-parent families are in the area? How many childless couples are in the area? How many couples with kids over 15, kids under 15? So lots of different things to actually start to think about. Now, once you, I guess, start to distill all of that, and as I said, in order to grab that information, you're going to go to, I guess, the ABS, or try and, I guess, get that distilled from places like Microburbs or Profile ID, or the AIFS, the Australian Institute for Family Services, I think is the name for that. Those guys are able to distill that and give that to you a little bit more graphically. What I would say is, if you can drive an Excel spreadsheet and if you can create some charts out of those things, you're going to get much more valuable data out of getting the raw data from ABS and being able to manipulate that yourselves. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of what is it that the other providers have actually distilled for you, and you may not get the level of granularity that you're actually looking at, okay? So when we start to look at some of these things, there's a few different trends that will start to apply, okay? So you want to start to see things like, well, how many of those are going to be single parents? How many of those are going to be potentially of a particular ethnicity where you might have a particular product type that they're actually looking for, or where they have multi-generational people living with them as part of their culture. You know, that sort of thing can be quite significant. So again, when we look back at last census back in 2016, almost 8.5% of households actually contained what they call extended family members. That is, that it was children living with a parent that it was really the children's home, but the parent was still living there. So it might be parents or grandparents. So the children were starting to look after that multi-generational family member, as opposed to the other way around, which is the parent looking after the child. So about 8.5%. So don't forget to actually look out for those sorts of things. Okay, so you know, and I'm not going to get this 100% correct, but there are, I guess, several of the, I guess, Asian family traits where that is, you know, multi-generational. There might be 2 or 3 generations living in the same household. Okay, so when you start to see that sort of thing, that might be an opportunity to say, well, we not only potentially need a larger home, we may actually want to have potentially a secondary dwelling for that person to actually have their own space, but still be part of that family unit. Okay, so opportunities for aging in place, wherever that happens, you want to make sure that you've got wider doorways, that you've got room for things like walking frames and potentially wheelchairs, that sort of thing, to actually be able to come into the area. Okay, you also want to start to think about when you start to see a lot of the younger, more professional, so white collar workers in an area. Now, we have gotten to the point where it had started to become a little bit of a trend to work from home, and then COVID kind of triggered that to go mass exodus from the workforce and actually start to genuinely realize that work from home actually does exist. So where you start to see that there's a large amount of owner occupiers and they're, I guess, of a, more professional white collar type workforce, you want to start to think about, should that stock actually have what is called a Zoom room, or a room a little bit like me here. This is the only thing I use my office for, is being able to run these Zoom presentations. So, you know, when you start to look at that sort of thing, you go, okay, well, maybe they don't need an extra bedroom, but they might actually need, I guess, study space per se to actually work from home. There's also things like designing for the future. So where people are starting to downsize. So as people are starting to age, they want to downsize into smaller homes where less maintenance. They don't have to mow a lawn or anything like that. They could go away for holiday for a month, 2 months, 3 months at a time and come back, and the house is exactly the same way that it was. That sort of thing, that designing for the future type approach, and the ability for that person to potentially move in their 50s and still be there when they're 70, 75, and age in place. You know, make sure that you do things like reinforce the wall beside the toilet so you can actually put one of those handrails at some point in the future. You won't put it in today. Do the same in the shower recess. You know, those sorts of things to go, well, we're actually going to cater for that now. It's an incremental cost to put that into the wall cavity day one, and it's going to reassure that person that as they set themselves up for the next 10, 15, 20 years, that they won't have to move out necessarily in that particular timeline, okay? So know that those sorts of things are going to be placed. How many places do you require that actually have a backyard is starting to diminish. The size of that backyard is equally starting to diminish. The number of bedrooms is actually starting to diminish, and the size of the dwellings is starting to diminish. So you really want to understand those demographics as much as you can to go, well, based on what I can see, based on age, sex, ethnicity, income stream, owner-occupier status, when you start to put all of that together, you can actually start to paint a little bit of a picture. And then what you want to do is go, okay, now that I know what should be expected in the area, let's now do some research on what actually exists in the area, okay? So is there some stock that's been there for many, many years that is currently going unserviced, for example? When was it created? What sort of amenity is it? Has there been any new stock brought to market for quite some time? Start to look at your development approvals. So many councils will allow you to subscribe to actually get alerts. So you can actually see all the development approvals that are in the area. Other councils will actually let you do historical searches. If you don't have any of those, then there are services that you can subscribe to. So one called planningalerts.org that will then allow you to get alerted for every single time a development application goes live in your particular area. So you're going to start to see, well, who is building competitive stock to what I actually want to do. Once you know how many development approvals are coming through, you can then go back to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and go, okay, well, let's start to have a look at how many building approvals were actually done in the area and how many finance approvals were actually done. Because getting a development approval is one thing, but if it's not actually funded, it can never actually be constructed. So you want to understand what that funnel looks like and what that pipeline looks like, so you can then understand, well, I know what the demand is. Now let's have a look at what the supply coming through the pipeline is. Is there an opportunity for me to actually step in? There you go, folks. That's a little bit about how to actually look at the demographics and try to work out how to determine what it is that you're going to be building for your new developments in your area. So for those of you who aren't aware, just to let you know that we run these Facebook Lives, these Sunday sessions, most Sundays, typically of a new topic every single time. And we have a back catalogue of those that we have archived off to YouTube. So if you liked what you saw today, make sure you go to our YouTube channel, search for Property Developer Network, or alternatively, click on the link below, propertydev.info/YouTube, and that will take you directly to our page. Equally, we run a couple of Facebook groups. So we have our Property Developer Network page, which is a great place to actually engage with your community, ask questions of the community, and the community will actually try to help you out. And we also have one called Development Site Deal Hub, where people are trading off-market deals and transactions. So there you go, folks. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the audience and see whether or not I can actually grab some questions. So give me 2 seconds while I try and do that, and see if through the magic of Facebook I can actually see who's out there and what questions you guys are asking. So lots of people saying hello. So Sean, Peter, Vijan, Shuri Barton, Adam, Rob, and a whole bunch more. So thank you, folks. Liana's got a comment here. Hi, Rob, great session. What's an example of how you would design the finished product differently if you're catering to investors instead of owner-occupiers and vice versa? Good question, Liana. So firstly, I would understand not just that it's an investor owning it, but who is actually going to be living in it, who they're going to rent to. So you really want to look at, I guess, still demographics of the area. So you've got who's going to own it versus what the product type needs to be. So I still want to look at the age. I still want to look at how many kids. I still want to look at those sorts of things to say, what is that stock? Because there's just as many people who want to be an investor for a downsizer as they would be for somebody wanting to invest in someone for, I guess, a young, upwardly mobile, for example. So it's really who is living in the area that would actually be impacting that. Then can they afford it, I guess, is the second one. So am I building it for that owner occupier? Now, the kinds of things that I would do for investor stock versus an owner occupier stock is I would make the product more robust. Okay, so make sure it can actually take the wear and tear. So making sure things like your surfaces are much more robust, that your tap types, whilst they are going to be aesthetically pleasing, you want to make sure that they've got a 10 or 15 year run cycle on those, rather than something that might look good and only last for 5 years, for example. So that's the kind of info, the kind of things that I'd be looking at. Cherie says, great info, thank you, appreciate that. Kelly says, thanks again, great session. Subod's done the same. So folks, we've got hardly any questions. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to throw a couple of questions out there. So Dominic says, Real Estate Institute of Australia, what can watch rhymed here, Rob? Not quite sure I understand that question, Dominique. I think what you're referring to is the fact that they've got that index that I was talking about, which is the income stream versus the size of the mortgage. So I will try to find that link and actually flick it into here, if that's what you mean. Other than that, folks, it looks like no questions from the crowd. You guys are being very shy today. Not a huge number online, but that might be the fact that Tomorrow is a public holiday. A lot of people have actually gone and taken the advantage of a long weekend. So given that's the case, I'm going to say thank you once again for your time, and I will see you next week for another Sunday session. Thanks, folks. Bye for now.